Have you ever looked at your original PlayStation system and thought, man, I really wish this played Game Boy games? Well, fortunately, back in the 90s, we had something called Innovation, the company. Yeah, in the 90s, we had some weird accessories, but this one was always interesting to me because it does indeed allow you to play Game Boy games on your PlayStation console using a port that really no one ever used, that being that parallel port on the back. So what we're gonna do here is unbox it, check it out, play some games on it, Game Boy games specifically, and then open it up and see how it works. So if you guys enjoy the video, make sure to like button and subscribe if you're new. So to start, the funny thing about this is they really went above and beyond to make sure you know this is not at all affiliated with Nintendo or Sony. First, they never use the Game Boy name itself. They just call it GB, so GB Booster, GB Games. It says it works with GB Color games. To my understanding, that's not correct. What it does is it technically puts shades of color on your typical, the black and green look for the DMG Game Boy, and adds at least something for your TV to display. But no, it doesn't necessarily work with games that are created specifically for the Game Boy Color, but we'll pop one of those in here in a bit and try it out. It's also called, I believe, the GB Hunter in different regions. Might have been that even in the US. But this is not a widely discussed accessory, so I'm sure no wonder that there are plenty of people who have never heard of this before. On the back, we have all kinds of descriptions in different languages. It does say PlayStation compatible at the top here, but then on the bottom, it says the PlayStation, that's a registered trademark of Sony, Game Boy registered trademark of Nintendo. This product's not licensed, sponsored, endorsed, or manufactured by any of those. Again, just doing everything they can to legally avoid any kind of backlash. Let's see, we have the booster itself and something else. I have like a manual. This at least goes over all the functionality that it has. I mean, it has a cheat system, so I guess you can do stuff like infinite lives, or I don't know, maybe have Mew just spawn in front of you or something, game trainers, and just kind of goes over how you do things like change the color palette, the editor borders, all of that. It also mentions here Rebound, which is a built-in game actually, so we'll have to check that out. The GB Booster, just kind of wrapped in a sleeve of bubble wrap here. And I mean, it feels pretty cheap, like the plastic that's used here. It's very light as well. I mean, there's probably not a lot going on in here. As you can see at the top, we have a Game Boy cartridge slot, and then we have our pin connector for the back of the PlayStation. So yeah, this is basically gonna stand straight up as it connects, and then it should, I guess, kind of display the Game Boy game that you put into it. So it would face towards you, actually. See, that's not a bad idea. At least it shows like what game you're playing right there above the PlayStation. And if you're wondering what slot I'm talking about, parallel port here, it's again, no wonder that most people didn't even know this was on the PlayStation because it was rarely, if ever, used. But in this case, it's just gonna slot and click in right here. And that's kind of it. You can see the PlayStation with Tetris being displayed there. I will give them some credit though when it comes to the GB Booster kind of blending in with the system. I mean, the plastics, the color, that at least matches up well enough to where it doesn't necessarily look like it is a first-party accessory, but it also doesn't look like something that's necessarily out of place with other third-party accessories. Okay, here we are with the GB Booster plugged in, the system turned on. I am running this through HDMI. I'm fortunate to have a PlayStation system that has an HDMI port directly soldered to the board and all this. I did an entire video showcasing it, but basically, we should get the best possible picture out of the GB Booster doing this. So this is Rebound Mission. So from what I could tell, I avoid that. I shoot the ball into the thing at the top, and then I get a score. But the thing running across the middle, it bounces it back and kills me. And that's one of my lives gone. So that is the pack-in game. It's a very basic title. I'm not really sure what else happens here other than I guess you reach a certain score, and then it goes to the next level. So there you go, that's Rebound. All right, let's actually try playing some Game Boy games. First thing I wanted to do, though, was pop in a Game Boy Color game. This is Mario Golf on the Game Boy Color specifically. I wanted to see if it would start up or even just show the message that a Game Boy Color will typically show on a regular Game Boy if you get it to at least boot up. And it looks like it's not doing anything with it. Okay, I did pop in Ready to Rumble Boxing, and it just comes up, this game only works on Game Boy Color. So indeed, it is just seen as a regular Game Boy. Maybe Mario Golf just wasn't being picked up correctly by it, but either way, that at least gives us an idea as to what we're working with. To start with the Game Boy library of titles, I went with the classic, that's Tetris. This should be pretty easy to run. I know it's not doing what we had with the Super Game Boy, where Nintendo basically just put an entire Game Boy in there, like all the guts and everything, to make it function correctly on the Super Nintendo. There is quite a bit of screen tearing that I'm noticing, where it's just missing pixels as, for example, the blocks fall down. Ooh, that might be easier to notice in maybe like Pokemon or something, because there's like the scrolling like screen that consistently moves. Maybe even Zelda, I don't know. At least for Tetris, seems to be working fine outside of the screen tearing. There's no audio though, and that you may notice that now. But yeah, nothing when it comes to audio emulation, or again, however they're doing this. We'll take a look inside the cartridge, because I am kind of curious how this is coming together exactly. But yeah, Tetris at least is functional. I did just start pressing buttons though, and now I have this menu system that came up: game, cheats, trainer, palette, options. So very quickly, let's explore this a bit. Screen size, normal, large. I guess large. I don't know. Do I go one? Video sync. All right. Frame skip. Let's make that 0. Let's go slow motion if we can. Then a CD player. So apparently what you can do is you can put a CD in there and it will play the audio from that CD while you are playing Game Boy games. So at least they found a way to cover up the fact that they can't reproduce or produce the audio from the Game Boy cartridge. You can just pick, I guess, whatever music CD you want. What's in game? Oh, just the game itself. From what I can tell, I press R1 and L1 and it opens it up after a few seconds. So it's one of those two buttons, or both of them, I guess, at the same time. Let me get to game though. Okay, so I made it larger. Oh, look at that! Look at that screen tear on that. I remember I turned the frame skip like all the way down. Ooh, yeah, that's kind of rough. Okay, maybe don't play around with the frame skip. Also, probably doesn't help that I made it large, like the screen size. Ooh, it's quite rough right now. Oh, look at this! I can, I guess, pick some colors and I guess just fill in the border. So they do have like cheats and trainers. Cheats kind of reminds me of Game Genie a bit. I guess you go in here and yeah, so you can play with different values, and I guess you can look some up. They also have trainer. It says cheats and then cheats 0, 8,192, too many cheats to display list. Not really sure what exactly is going on there necessarily. But, okay. So it does at least have something when it comes to cheat codes and stuff, but it's not exactly straightforward. And I guess for cheats, you would just have to look some up for this one. Next up, we're going to try Ninja Turtles Fall of the Foot Clan. It's a pretty basic, like, 2D beat 'em up, I guess you can call it that, on the Game Boy. Ooh, yeah, that's rough. I mean, it's already kind of slow, and it has, like, ghosting and stuff on the Game Boy. It's significantly worse here, though. Obviously, you can see it right now. Play this on something like the Analog Pocket or a Super Game Boy, and it's way different looking. Everything's just flashing constantly. I guess the backgrounds are scrolling okay. The characters are flashing, and they're screen tearing around them. Again, it's not exactly a very precise, we'll say, 2D platformer or beat 'em up, but hey, at least it's technically working, just not the greatest quality. So just for the record, The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening DX, specifically the black cartridge that had the extra dungeons in it for, I believe, Game Boy Color systems, does not appear to work at all here. So I don't know if it's a compatibility thing or what, because the cartridge works on all the other Game Boy systems that I have. I would typically use that in different videos to show off new screens or something that come out. So unfortunate there. I don't know if it has certain like compatibility for it, maybe a list out there you can look at to see what games work and what games don't, but unfortunately Link's Awakening DX does not appear to be one that functions on it. Next up we have Super C. This one doesn't look as bad when it comes to like the sprites blinking or even screen tearing, actually. This one looks all right. I think it's a little slower than how it runs on the Game Boy. I remember this was a really cool game to have on the Game Boy. I mean, Contra was super, super popular on the Nintendo, the original Nintendo system. Really, really good game for that platform. And getting it on the Game Boy, again, at that time, having some of these titles portable was actually like flat out impressive at times, especially for the Game Boy with all the stuff that's on screen. You do have a lot of enemies, you have a lot of projectiles flying around, so it did push the Game Boy a bit at the time. And for what was, again, around the Game Boy then, we had a lot of the Tiger handhelds. This was some mind-blowing stuff. And then speaking of mind-blowing stuff, we have Pokemon on the PlayStation using the GB Booster, which was like blasphemy back in the day, right? Having Pokemon on the PlayStation, but here we are. It has like this border that loaded up with it. I don't know if it's trying to load the border from like the cartridge, or it has some sort of like compatibility there to where because it reminds me of the Super Game Boy border, just terrible looking. I mean, like the sprites, like Squirtle isn't even filled out with the background of the Pokeballs there or anything, but technically it started up, so let's see how this one runs. People don't realize that even like Pokemon actually did push the Game Boy a bit with some of the stuff it was doing, so I'm kind of curious with screens. Okay, that's not bad. You can see I have a color mode on, frame skip at 2, size normal, and if I go back, I mean, it was running fairly well, all things considered. It does still have a little bit of that like juddering kind of to it. Slight amount of screen tearing as well, but I mean, yeah, again, it's strange to see Pokemon on a PlayStation. Let's go in here and see if I can get into a battle real quick. I'm just curious how it deals with like the scrolling and everything else. Yeah, it's not bad actually. And it also has added some color to it, like you have the bars that are green here. I'm curious if I get hit enough by Rattata if my bar will turn yellow and then red and all that. Even Squirtle's kind of has that nice blue hue to him. So let's do a battle here. And yeah, it changes color. It's yellow. So it is at least adding something to the game when it comes to playing it on your PlayStation on your TV as opposed to your Game Boy, in the sense that you do kind of get the Super Game Boy features with the color palettes and all of that. And then finally, I popped in Pokemon Yellow. That was a kind of a later release for the Game Boy and did at least attempt to take advantage of some of the Game Boy Color features with the different palettes and stuff, and it doesn't seem to work. So kind of in that same group actually as Link's Awakening DX, right? Where it had a little bit of that crossover between Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Seems like the GB Booster, at least for me, doesn't really like those titles. And then finally, let's talk about the GB Booster and how it works. There's only 2 screws holding it together and then a few posts inside that kind of clip in. Once you remove that, though, you can see 2 chips on the board. And that's pretty much all that runs this thing. Now, looking at these chips, one appears to be an FPGA that I assume has been programmed to basically try to run Game Boy games while also communicating to the PlayStation for video out and all of this. The other chip is from WinBond, and this is interesting because it's a 2 megabit flash memory. And I was trying to figure out what was going on here with the Game Boy games specifically, because if you play a game where it does have a save backup, like Pokemon Blue, for example, and you go into the menu and hit save when you're ready to turn it off, it doesn't actually write that save back to the game cartridge natively. You have to go into the menu for the GB Booster, go to save backup, at which point it will then write it to the cartridge, I guess the state that you're at there. And it kind of makes me think that what's happening is the cartridge itself is just basically dumping most, if not all of basically the ROM into the flash memory, and then it's being emulated with that FPGA For example, I can actually just remove the cartridge when I'm playing it normally here on the PlayStation, and it will continue to function fine in something like Tetris. This can also explain some of the poor performance and weird things we see when it's trying to emulate these Game Boy games, because the way Nintendo did it with the Super Game Boy, they basically just put the hardware from the Game Boy in that cartridge, and that's why it ran so well. Bit of a different approach here, and one that unfortunately yields much poorer results. But I'll admit it's certainly an interesting piece of history, and while it's not the ideal way to play a Game Boy game with the wealth of options we have now, and it's kind of neat to just load up something like Pokemon on the PlayStation. And again, that's blasphemous talk right there from the 90s. But hey, technically it's possible with the GB booster, and well, you get some pretty interesting results with it. But let me know what you guys thought about this one down below with the GB booster, allowing the original PlayStation with the parallel port to play Game Boy games. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.